call came on a Tuesday in November, when the first real snow of the season was falling soft over Toronto, and the city looked, for a brief hour, like it might be capable of forgiveness. Norman Ashbridge stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office on the 42nd floor, the tower he'd built himself, on a site everyone told him would never sell, and listened to Dr. Kenneth Parrish deliver the verdict he had been dreading for 7 months. "We've exhausted every available protocol." Parrish's voice was measured, careful, polished by years of practice into something smooth enough not to snag on the way down. "The cortical degradation is advancing faster than our most recent models anticipated. At this stage, the compassionate course would be to discuss the transition to palliative care. There's a coordinator I'd like you and Caroline to." Norman set the phone on the windowsill without hanging up. He could hear Parrish still speaking, a thin thread of sound at the edge of the room. He didn't pick it up again. Ben was 9 years old. 7 months ago, he had been the kind of boy who could make a room feel full just by entering it. The laugh that arrived before he did, the questions about everything, the Blue Jays' batting averages memorized like scripture and recited with the passion of a seasoned analyst. He had Norman's stubbornness and his mother's warmth, and he had been starting center for his Pee Wee League team, and he had scored the winning goal in his league playoffs, and he had been happy in the uncomplicated way of children who don't yet know there's any other kind. Now he lay in a private room at Sick Kids, connected to machines that breathed for him and monitored the slow, steady withdrawal of his nervous system from the world. Progressive neural atrophy. 3 words that contained, somehow, the entire distance between who Ben had been and what he was now. Norman had done everything that money made possible. He flew in specialists from Vancouver, Montreal, Baltimore, and London. He funded research until Sick Kids' neurology department was the most generously supported in the country. He arranged access to every trial, every experimental protocol, every long shot documented anywhere in the medical literature. Dr. Kenneth Parrish, chief of pediatric neurology and the most cited researcher in his field in Canada, had accepted all of it and delivered, month after month, the same conclusion in progressively gentler language. Nothing more could be done. Norman retrieved the phone. "Tomorrow, my office, 8 o'clock. He didn't wait for the response. His assistant, Faye, appeared at his office door. She had worked with him for 11 years and had learned when to speak and when to simply be present. "Caroline called twice," she said. "The hospital's palliative care coordinator left a message as well. Cancel anything she's scheduled." "Norman." "Please, Faye." He walked to the hospital that evening through the cold, rather than taking the car. He needed the 20 minutes of being nobody. Just a man in a dark coat moving through a city that didn't know his face, past the coffee shops on Queen Street, past the flower market that stayed open even in November, past kids on bikes with no idea how quickly everything could go silent. Caroline was in Ben's room when he arrived, reading aloud from the hockey almanac, Ben's copy, with margin notes in his careful printing, her voice steady and low, the voice she used when she was holding herself together entirely by will. She looked up when Norman came in, and something in her expression told him that Parrish had already called her too. "Hey, champ," Norman said, pulling a chair close and taking Ben's hand. It was warm and still and impossibly familiar. "Dad's here. The Leafs blew another third period. You really won't believe it this time." Caroline stepped quietly into the hallway. Norman talked for 2 hours. He talked about the Leafs, about the ice rink at Harbourfront, where they'd skated every February since Ben was 3, about the fishing trip to the Kawarthas he'd been promising for 3 years running. He talked about the Cardinals, Ben's team, who had named a new starting center and were struggling without him. He watched his son's face for anything, a twitch, a change in breath, any flicker of presence behind the stillness. There was nothing, or rather, there was everything that should have been there and wasn't. Near midnight, Norman pressed his forehead against the back of Ben's hand, the way he had when Ben was an infant, and cried through his first fever. "I'm not done yet, Bud," he said. "I want you to know that. I'm not done." He meant it completely. He had no idea yet what it was going to cost him. The meeting with Parrish the next morning left Norman colder than the November air outside. He walked without destination, south through the annex and past the university. west until the streets narrowed and the smell changed to cardamom and coffee and wet pavement, until he found himself standing in Kensington Market, which had resisted becoming anything other than itself for 60 years, and seemed determined to keep doing so. He went into a small Sri Lankan tea house on Augusta Avenue, mostly because his legs had stopped working toward anywhere in particular. The woman behind the counter, who had the unhurried air of someone who had been watching people arrive exactly like this for decades, set a cup of dark tea in front of him without asking. "You look like you need something warm," she said. He sat at a table by the fogged window and stared at the tea and did not drink it. He became aware, gradually, of a girl at the corner table. 11 or 12, he guessed. Dark hair pulled back, an oversized school sweatshirt with a St. Anthony's crest, a science textbook open in front of her, and a pencil tucked behind one ear. She was watching him with the frank, uncomplicated curiosity that belongs to children who haven't yet learned to pretend they aren't looking. "You haven't touched it," she said. "The tea." Norman looked up. "I know. My mom does that. Stares at her coffee without drinking it. It usually means something's really wrong." She said it as a fact, not a comfort. Is something wrong? He should have offered a polite deflection and returned to his thoughts. Instead, he heard himself say, "My son is in the hospital. The doctors are telling me there's nothing more they can do." The girl was quiet for a moment. "What's he got?" "Something called progressive neural atrophy. His brain." "I had that," she said. The tea house went completely still. Outside, someone's cart scraped the cobblestones. Norman set down his cup. "That's not possible. PNA is terminal." "I know." She closed her textbook and moved to the chair across from him without being invited. "My doctor told my mom that too. 3 years ago. I was on a ventilator for almost 4 months. She paused, considering. "I remember everything from that time. People think you can't hear, but you can hear everything that happens in the room. You just can't answer." Norman stared at her. She had clear, unhurried eyes. The eyes of someone who had passed through something enormous and came out the other side, carrying it differently than most people carry anything. "What happened?" he said. "My mom," she said simply, "and my great-grandmother's knowledge. Mom's Métis. Her grandmother was a traditional healer, learned it from her grandmother before her. When the doctors gave up on me, my mom brought me home and used those methods. She said it without drama, the way you describe something that is simply true. I remember hearing her voice, for months, just her voice, every day telling me to find my way back. Eventually I did. Her name was Tara. Her mother's name was Frances. If he wanted to know more, she said, she could write down her mother's number. She wrote it in careful block letters on a tea house napkin and slid it across the table. Frances arrived 40 minutes later, still in the maintenance staff jacket from the school where she worked, her hair pulled up from a shift that had started before 6. She stopped when she saw Norman. She looked at Tara, a whole private conversation in a single exchange, and then she pulled a chair to the table and sat. She was direct in the way of people who have been forced by circumstance to skip the preamble. She had tried, she told him, to bring Tara's recovery to the attention of medical journals, hospital ethics boards, and 2 health reporters at the Toronto papers. She had been dismissed, then pitied, and then, in Dr. Parrish's case, warned. He had suggested that continuing to make claims about traditional healing methods might constitute the promotion of dangerous misinformation. He had retroactively amended Tara's diagnosis from confirmed PNA to atypical cortical inflammation with spontaneous resolution, which neatly explained away everything without requiring him to acknowledge what had actually taken place. He knew exactly what he was doing, Frances said. Her voice didn't rise. Tara recovered. He wanted her for a research program at a private facility. When I refused, the paperwork changed. She laid a folder on the table. Inside was Tara's complete medical file from Sick Kids, the original PNA diagnosis, confirmed independently by 3 neurologists, including Parrish himself. 8 months of treatment records, and Parrish's revised assessment, dated 3 months after Frances had refused the research offer and taken Tara home for good. Norman read through every page. "If I wanted to try," he said finally, "what would it involve?" "Consistency," Frances said. "These methods work with the body's own systems, not against them. Specific pressure points along the neural pathways, sound frequencies at particular ranges, herbal preparations administered carefully, daily movement sequences to maintain muscle memory, and constant sensory engagement. Familiar voices, familiar music, familiar smells. His mind needs anchors back to itself. She looked at him steadily. And someone should talk to him who understands what he's experiencing from the inside, not to comfort him, to give him a map. Tara, who had been listening with the quiet attention of someone who had heard this before and knew which parts were essential, looked up from her book. "I'll talk to him," she said. "I know what it's like in there. He should know someone else got out." Norman's security team spent 4 days verifying everything Francis had told him. Dr. Kenneth Parrish had been receiving research funding from Pharmalux Canada for 11 years. Their flagship project was a management drug for PNA, not a cure, but a lifelong protocol that would slow cortical degradation and require indefinite administration, a treatment that would become commercially worthless the moment a cure was documented. Parrish's most recent grant renewal, awarded 6 months after Tara walked out of Sick Kids on her own, was worth $4 million. Norman considered this information for one afternoon. Then he called Francis and told her he wanted to try. She came the next morning with Tara and 2 canvas bags, and she walked into Ben's room at the Rosedale house. The guest wing had been converted into a full medical suite, round-the-clock nursing staff. Dr. Parrish retained as consulting physician under terms that suited nobody's comfort, but served the necessary purpose, and she moved through the space with the quiet authority of someone who had done this before. She assessed the equipment, the angle of light, the sound level of the machines. She spoke with the nursing team about what could be repositioned without compromising monitoring. They were skeptical, as they had every right to be, and they rearranged what they safely could. She asked for photographs of Ben's life. Hockey, friends, the dog, fishing gear, his team. She asked for his Cardinals jersey, which she draped over the chair nearest the bed. She asked for his music. His playlist, Caroline told her, started with Tragically Hip and ended with whatever his teammates were listening to that week, and Francis played it from a small speaker at low volume. Then she sat beside Ben, took his hand, and began to speak to him. Not loudly, not dramatically, in the same even tone she might use with someone sitting across from her at a kitchen table. She talked about the room, about the jersey on the chair, about the window and what was outside it. She talked to him as though his comprehension had never been in question. In the evenings after Francis left, Tara moved to the chair beside the bed. The adults learned to leave the room when she did this. Whatever happened in those sessions belonged to something they didn't have language for yet. "I know you can hear me," Tara told him the first evening, directly, without softening. "I heard everything when I was like you. I heard the nurses and the TV in the hallway and my mom crying once at 3 in the morning when she thought I was too far under to know. I wasn't. I just couldn't say so." She settled back in the chair as though she intended to stay a while. "I just want you to know someone else has been where you are, and I'm sitting here doing homework right now, just so you know." Caroline heard this from the hallway. She stood there for a long moment, her hand pressed flat against the wall, and did not speak. 10 days passed without visible change. Norman sat with Ben every morning, talking. He had stopped checking his watch during those hours. He had stopped answering most of his calls. Faye was managing the company with her usual formidable competence and had stopped forwarding him messages that could wait. On the 11th morning he was reading from the hockey almanac, out loud, the way Caroline did, the way that felt less like pretending and more like refusing to stop when he felt it. A pressure, small and specific and impossible to explain away. Ben's fingers, wrapped loosely around his father's hand, had tightened. Norman stopped reading. He sat very still and said quietly, "Ben, if you can hear me, do that again." 3 seconds passed, in which he forgot how to breathe. Then Ben's hand closed around his, deliberate, unmistakable. Norman pressed the call button with his free hand. He did not release Ben's hand for anything that followed. Not for the nurse's arrival. Not for Parrish's examination 20 minutes later. Not for the assessment that Parrish conducted with the controlled, careful disbelief of a man watching something occur that he had spent years explaining was beyond the realm of possibility. "It may be involuntary motor response," Parrish said. "Ask him yourself," Norman said. Parrish leaned toward the bed. "Ben, if you understand me, squeeze my hand." The pause lasted long enough that the doctor began to straighten. Ben squeezed. After that, the recovery came at its own pace, in increments that had nothing to do with the timelines Norman would have preferred. Fingers first, then eyelids, a flutter, then an opening, and then the eyes tracking the room and finding Norman's face and staying there, recognizing him. Caroline was present the moment that happened. She made a sound he had never heard her make before, something beyond language. And she reached for Ben's hand and said, "There you are, sweetheart, there you are." 3 weeks later, the respiratory team attempted a brief trial of independent breathing. They withdrew the ventilator tube with careful hands, and the room held itself absolutely still, and then Ben drew a breath. Slow, effortful, his own, and then another. And then his lips moved. Norman leaned close, convinced he had imagined it. "Don't go," Ben whispered, and then, with the effort of someone lifting something very heavy from the inside, "Dad, don't go." Norman Ashbridge pressed his forehead against his son's and wept without any effort to stop himself, without any thought of what it looked like or who was in the room. The meeting with Parrish took place in Norman's office 3 weeks after Ben first spoke. Francis sat to Norman's left. 2 folders rested on the table between them. Tara's original medical documentation and the financial records linking Parrish to Pharmalux Canada. Both were closed. Norman let the silence hold for a moment before he spoke. "You have 2 choices," he said. "Cooperate with what we're proposing, or both of these folders go to the College of Physicians and Surgeons, the Toronto Star, and every health reporter who's taken my calls this month. Tomorrow morning." Parrish looked at the folders. He was a man who had built his entire professional identity on the certainty that certain things were beyond the boundary of possibility. Having that boundary rearranged by a maintenance worker's canvas bag of herbal preparations was not something he had ever considered preparing for. "What you're describing," he said carefully, "has no peer-reviewed evidentiary basis." "I'm asking you to examine Ben," Norman said, "and Tara, and then to tell me honestly what you see." Frances spoke without raising her voice. "There's also a woman in Winnipeg. Her daughter had confirmed PNA. My grandmother helped that family years before she helped mine. Her daughter is 34 now. She teaches elementary school." The room was very quiet. Parrish's jaw worked for a moment. When he finally spoke, it seemed to cost him something that was genuinely not easy to pay. "I cannot say that these methods caused the recoveries. What I can say is that I can no longer rule it out, and that I have an obligation as a scientist to investigate what I cannot explain." "That's all I'm asking," Norman said, "for now." The Ashbridge Centre for Integrative Neurology was announced in February at the Royal Ontario Museum, on one of those clear, brutal Toronto winter days when the cold makes everything look freshly cut from something hard and clean. Norman had pledged $30 million in initial funding. 2 other families had contacted him privately in the weeks before the announcement, families who had read about Ben's improvement and had children of their own in similar silence, and they stood with him at the back of the room. Norman delivered most of his prepared remarks before he set down the paper. "7 months ago," he said, "I was told there was nothing left to do. I was told that the kindest thing I could do for my son was to let go." He paused. "There are parents being told the same thing right now, in this city, across this country. Some of them are facing something that medicine genuinely cannot touch yet, and finding the courage to accept that is its own impossible work. But some of them are being told to give up by a system that stopped asking all the questions." He looked at Francis, who gave him a small, steady nod. "This center exists to ask what's been left unasked, to take seriously what's been dismissed, not to replace medicine, to make it larger." Dr. Parrish was seated in the 4th row. He had agreed to an advisory role, with conditions, and he was present, and Norman had decided, with more difficulty than he expected, that people who changed their minds deserved recognition, because changing your mind when you've built your life around the old position is not a small thing. Afterward, in the green room behind the main hall, Norman found Tara and Ben together in the corner. Ben was in a wheelchair, still working toward the independent walking he would achieve 4 months later, and Tara was showing him something on her phone, soccer footage, her own team from the previous spring. "Do you want to learn?" she was asking him. "I can't run yet," Ben said, His voice was slow, deliberate, each word placed with care, but it was his voice, unmistakably, the one Norman had been listening for through 7 months of machines. Neither could I. Tara shrugged, that whole-body shrug that had stopped surprising Norman weeks ago. You just start by standing on the grass. That's all first. Just stand. Norman leaned in the doorway and watched them. This 11-year-old who had been where Ben had been and found her way back, and his son, who was finding his way toward the same light. There was something moving between them that no medical chart had a column for, something that would take years to name and might resist it anyway. Frances appeared quietly beside him. She followed his gaze. She'll do something remarkable, Norman said, with her life. She already has, Frances said. Outside, the February sky had done what it occasionally, unexpectedly does over Toronto, opened into something clear and absolute, and the snow on the museum steps was turning white gold in the low afternoon light, and the city below looked, from up here, like it was only just beginning. Ben found Norman's face from across the room. He raised one hand, slowly, with full intention, with the deliberate effort of someone who understood exactly what it had taken to recover that gesture, and waved. Norman raised his hand back. He held his son's gaze and kept it, and did not look away.